Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Knee Deep in the Pod. I'm Dan.
And I'm Chris, and this podcast is basically a place for us to talk about games and reminisce about the good old days when we actually had time to play them. On this episode, we're going to talk about level design.
But before we dive into that, Chris, why don't you just tell us what you've been playing this last week or 2 weeks or, in recent time, whenever you had the time.
Whenever I clawed the time in my life to play a game. You know what? There are a few that come to mind. I've been spending a bit of time playing Dusk lately.
Have you?
I have. So I know you. I think you actually introduced me to this game initially, and we have some friends that are into it. So some things culminated, and it's been in my library, sort of vying for my attention for a little while, and I've started playing. For those that don't know, it's kind of you might refer to it as a sort of boomer shooter style game these days. So they're kind of a sort of first-person shooter inspired by shooters of the sort of mid to late 90s. Although I'm told by my friend that it's about to kind of mess with expectations and turn some of those things on its head. I haven't got that far yet, so we shall see. So I've been really enjoying that. And similarly, actually, I've been playing Quake 2 properly for the first time. Again with a friend, doing that co-op actually. In my childhood, I'd only really played Quake 2 as in death matches essentially with you actually, Dan.
I remember.
And your brothers. Yeah, so that was kind of my introduction to Quake 2. And I actually remember playing it on PC briefly as a single player, and it was just, I don't know, I think I was just so used to the fast-paced and access to all the different weapons that you get from the multiplayer experience that I started playing single player, and I was like, this isn't what I expected, this is wrong, and I just walked away.
Is it more sort of slow and strategic?
I'm not sure I'd call it slow and strategic, but it was just, I don't know, the quick pace of human players darting around, and then there's the kind of, the enemies are a bit more imagine the kind of slow paced moving of Doom monsters, for example. They are, compared to you, it's like you're on a skateboard and they're on crutches. It's and it's kind of a little bit like that, which is fine, but it was just I don't know, it was just my expectations were off, I think. So anyway, that's what I've been up to. What have you been up to, Dan?
I played a bit of Overcooked with a friend. We've been trying to just 100% that game. We've got 3 stars on every level now in the first 5 worlds, I think.
Whoa.
So that's been fun and infuriating in equal measure. And I've also been playing for a good few months now this game called Melvor Idle, which is an idle game that's inspired by RuneScape. And I've just been really enjoying it. I just like watching the numbers go up. Right now, even as we're recording this, I'm training my agility. I'm level 87, something like that. Yeah. So yeah, that's keeping me busy, and it's good because if you don't have a lot of time, you don't need a lot of time. It just plays itself.
You can just dip in, right?
You dip in, yeah. You tell it what to do, and you come back in 8 hours.
Yeah, love that. I'm tempted to sort of to just dive into some RuneScape chat now, because I know that we both remember that very fondly from our childhood, and there are actually some projects that you've undertaken as a result, but I fear we won't ever make it to our topic. So we were going to talk about level design today, and there are all sorts of directions to take this conversation. But before we go too far, I thought a good place to start would just be to sort of define what we're on about, maybe make a few ground rules. So, Dan, I think you're actually quite well placed to take this question. What is, in the context of games, what is level design? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, this is actually a really good question to start with, because it's not as straightforward as you might think. Because I was thinking about this today, and instinctively, when I think about level design, I'm imagining a 2D or 3D space that I can jump around in. Maybe there are doors, maybe there are stairs, maybe there are lifts, whatever. But it occurred to me that, you know, arguably a real-time strategy game has level design, you know, but it's just a very, very different kind of level design. So if we're talking like very broadly, level design is about making a space that looks nice and plays nice and has some sort of shape or boundaries that restrict the player's movement. But I suspect, in practical terms, we'll probably be talking more about classic 2D spaces and 3D spaces that you might see in like a Mario game or your Quake 2.
Sure. No, that's a good place to start. And I also suspect you are correct in that. But, you know, it's interesting you mentioned the real-time strategy example there, because that exact thought went through my mind, sort of considering this earlier. And I think, you know, that does warrant some discussion as well. But yeah, as you say, it's a very different beast, I suppose. Okay, so here's a follow-up question for you. Having sort of set some vague ground rules there, and what is good level design? Like in the most, I guess, in the broadest sense, and we can get sort of into some nitty-gritty stuff in a little while.
Oof, yeah, immediately I want to dive into the nitty-gritty, but in the broad sense, level design is going to lead to fun gameplay. And that in itself is a very hard thing to define. I think that that's something game developers struggle with a lot, is what we call finding the fun.
Yeah.
And I've heard that ideally a game needs to tread the line between frustration and boredom. Because if it's too easy, the player's going to get bored. If it's too hard, the player's going to get frustrated. And I think level design is like a very important part of that. Because if you take a game like, just the first game that comes to my mind, Doom. If a level's really easy, maybe there aren't any monsters, or it's just too straightforward, too linear, it's boring, right? Whereas if you have a level that's too hard, like it's too many monsters, or frankly, it's just too maze-like and you get lost, then players could get frustrated. So it's a balance.
Okay, so that's the challenge that designers are fighting with or grappling with all the time. Finding the fun in their level design.
What do you think makes good level design?
Yeah, so I mean, just to pick up on that context thing for a second. So like it's different for different genres, I suppose, but also even within a genre, you know, because I guess level design incorporates a lot of stuff, and you know, even to like, I don't know if artwork is quite quite lands on this. Maybe that's a different, you know, department or a different like skill, but you know, or like creation of those assets. But certainly like use of the game's assets is part of level design, and you know, it does actually. It surprises me sometimes just how much detail there is in a level, whether that's, you know, like wall decorations in a, I don't know, in a first person shooter, you know, or just any sort of 3D environment, you know, kind of the decorations on the walls and I don't know, furniture, and you know, just the stuff that you run around, and you kind of, you know, to some degree pay no mind to, but it's just part of the experience, and it's one of those things you notice most when it's not there, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. You know, a lot of games, or certainly older games, would give you like an editor, wouldn't they? You know, like, here, make your own levels if you want, or you know, you could even go as far as doing mods and stuff. That wasn't really my bag, but you know, I'd make the odd level for a bit of fun, and you know, even in like, you know, like simple shooter levels, or you know, making like multiplayer maps for that, in that sort of context, it's amazing just how much you need to put in for it to feel like a professional map, like a map that you would expect to see in an actual game. And I think the pinnacle example I have for this sort of thing is actually Heroes 3. The maps on those games are pretty huge, and once you've kind of placed towns and roads and, you know, maybe like the kind of buildings you need for resources, so this is like a turn-based strategy game for people that don't know, it's then kind of mind-boggling. You realise just how bare your map looks when all you've done is the essentials.
Yeah.
And the amount of detail that is like trees and shrubs and some streams and some, like just like the landscape of it. It's huge. Like the amount of detail that's in there, and the editors, sometimes you get tools that kind of help you do that. Just like random add random shrubbery items here, and you just kind of cast your brush of like shrubbery, and it will kind of do lots of because it's not just all the same assets or tiles. It's kind of it's a whole mishmash of them all, and it looks when you put them all together it looks right, but it's just not. If you don't have that, it just doesn't look right. So that's a long rambly way of saying level design between games is quite different, and the importance of something like kind of almost that slightly artistic flair of and kind of decoration and that sort of stuff is part of it as well. But what was your question? Was like, what do I think good game design or good level design is? Sorry,
so it was the same question to you, like broadly, what is good level design? But can I just touch on what you've said there?
Yeah,
because you're absolutely right in identifying like two fairly distinct elements of a level's design. There's the sort of functional aspect of it, like how does the level play, and then there's the art aspect of it, and those are typically handled by, like, as you kind of alluded to, very, very different teams. So normally you'll have level designers might make what they call a block out version of the level, which is just boxes and cubes, just like a bare bones version of the level that you can play. And then the art team will come along and art it up and just make it look amazing.
Right.
And what I find really interesting is looking at some screenshots from like AAA games, like modern AAA games, where they show you the before and after of that process. So you can see, like, for example, for the Jedi Survivor game that came out, they released a bunch of screenshots of like the block out levels side by side with like the arted up versions.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating because the block out is obviously so primitive, but yet it translates directly to what you see in the final game.
Wow, that's so interesting. And like I'm particularly interested to hear a lot of your insights on this topic, Dan, because as viewers, so this is might have picked up on previous episodes. Dan is a game developer. He's made his own games and he works for a game development company. So he's kind of a man on the inside for this one. So I think something else that comes to mind when I think of level design is kind of teaching the player and introducing concepts to the player. I still remember this from. Do you remember that like indie game movie or whatever it was, like that documentary that was like that followed? What was it? Braid, Super Meat Boy, and Fez.
Yeah, I loved that documentary. Absolutely loved it.
Excellent. And I remember them actually talking about kind of this idea of introducing concepts to the player. For Super Meat Boy, it was like, here's this like grinder that like if you jump on it, it's going to kill it's going to kill Super Meat Boy, and you're going to have to go back to the beginning. And like so here's like the grinder, and then here's like two together, which means you need to like do a bit of a running jump to get over them, so you don't get mashed. And then next up, like next level along or further on in the level or whatever it is, we've introduced the grinder, we've introduced like two of them together. Now we've introduced a grinder that moves from side to side, and it's kind of like, it's just like this gradual development of this idea, and it's like the player is like brought along, as they go, like they see it and can follow that development. So I guess that's kind of that's level design in a slightly broader sense of like either that's a long level or that's level, or that's kind of a levels developing as you go along. So it's kind of a sequence of levels, I suppose, when it comes to level design. So this idea of kind of teaching the player certainly is in my mind for this topic. And like on that note, with Braid, it was I don't even know what to call them, but they're kind of almost like these lion head looking things, like lion heads with feet. I don't know what that is.
Oh,
but
the enemies.
yeah, the enemies.
Yeah.
And they kind of introduce the enemies and like from in different scenarios and kind of how they behave. Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, if anything, my criticism is that there isn't enough variety of enemies in Braid, but they've got all the mechanic stuff going on in the world, so I'll let them get away with it. The other thing that comes to mind about level design and teaching the player, I was listening about this lately in a documentary talking about what they referred to as Valvian level design. Valvian design principles, or I think is roughly what they called it. So this was the Black Mesa team. So this is the team that did like the remake of Half-Life, and they talked a lot about kind of design principles that they've learned from Valve, and like they were wanting to kind of make sure they use that in their kind of I don't know, their rule book of like when they were creating that game and like recreating, but also then later on adding new content and stuff to the original game. And I'm gonna I'm not gonna get every step right, but essentially there's this kind of sequence of like you kind of show the player almost before they even have to do something. So like one example might be like there's like a loose electrical cable, right? And then there's a puddle of water, and the loose electrical cable gets like gets kicked into the water. Nothing, no drama yet. And then like an enemy walks down the corridor. They walk into the puddle. They get electrocuted, and explode, whatever. The game's, without you even having to participate, the game has now taught you that like electrical wire in water, bad things happen. Okay. And then like later on you'll see like the same puzzle or the same kind of concept, but like abstracted slightly. So like there's a puddle, there's a wire, they're not currently touching, but to like defeat these enemies or to solve this puzzle, you now need to like bring those two together. You've seen it before, now you just need to like make it happen yourself. And and then like another step might be like another layer of abstraction, like I don't know, you need to like flick a switch to do the power, to do the simple example. And you could sort of apply the same principles in various different ways, like when it comes to introducing like new weapons or whatever. But essentially, it's that kind of teaching the player step by step, and each time you sort of introduce the concept again, you kind of just let the player kind of I don't know, make them make another step or make them make another leap to kind of fully round their understanding of this concept you've kind of brought into your game.
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, those are some of my thoughts about level design and good level design that come to mind when I'm thinking about this topic.
Yeah, and I've mentioned Mario Maker, I think, in the last episode, because it's been following it a lot recently, and I think that's a game where this kind of theory really shines, because the levels are small, and the best levels really do tend to like follow this principle of like, here's a basic mechanic, and then here's that mechanic shown to you in a slightly different way, and there's a slightly different challenge each time. So you learn the mechanic, and then you have to apply it in different ways, and it makes the level feel very
strong theme to it.
Yeah, very intentional, and very strongly themed around a certain mechanic, rather than just being a bunch of random elements thrown together.
Sure. And actually, you saying that brings a couple of things to mind, but like this is maybe jumping ahead, I suppose, in some regards, but the good level design. So I mean, certainly, like, or I guess like, I'm always jumping to the end when it comes, like, because I'm thinking of a boss now, and often I'll sort of hear, or people might suggest that like a boss battle, or like maybe it's the end of the episode or whatever. That those sorts of levels, the intention is can often be, okay, we've taught you all these things through different levels. Maybe like this level we taught you this thing, this level we taught you this other thing. and like the boss level is like, right, now you need to like, it's the game like essentially testing you, like, were you paying attention, like like you now need to use all the different things you've learned to like defeat the boss, and that's the kind of, you've mastered the, you've mastered these mechanics, or you've mastered the game essentially if you can beat the boss, because it's like you need to do all of the things. And yeah, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on that, but that certainly seems to be like a common narrative, is like that's kind of the purpose of a boss, or one of the kind of maybe one of the hallmarks of a good boss, or a well-designed boss level perhaps. Yeah, and the other thing is, I suppose, you were mentioning earlier the idea of like the balance between like getting bored and being frustrated. But I do find it interesting sometimes about like the intentionality of like designing a level to make a player feel something in particular. And I wonder how like mindful designers are when they're doing this. But sometimes you might make I don't know. You might intentionally make a level that's like feels quite frenetic, or quite like there's a lot going on, but a lot of it is easy stuff, and it's like, so like it feels like there's a lot of action, but actually the kind of essentially the involvement of the player, or what's required of the player to beat the level, is not particularly hard, but there's maybe quite a lot of it. And that can make the player maybe like feel quite good about themselves, like they're kind of bossing it. I've heard, back to the boss level thing for a second, I've heard that sometimes a player might defeat a boss, and then the subsequent, let's say like the subsequent level, or the subsequent like little section after that, is intentionally easy to make the player feel like they are just now like a powerhouse, like they're just bossing the game, like I've just defeated that big boss, and like these guys that I'm coming up against just like pow pow pow, like nothing can touch me. And like and that's like an intentional design choice, to be like, we're going to make the player feel really good for a little bit.
Give them a sort of reward.
Yeah, there's a reward and a kind of relief before we start kind of, really challenging them again.
That's interesting. Can I throw a spanner in the works here?
Please.
Because we've talked about the idea of teaching the player and building on these mechanics up until, maybe culminating in a boss fight. And I think this is like a fairly well-established design principle these days in level design. I mean, I'm not a level designer, but this is certainly something I've seen a lot in games. Now, my question is, with this theory being as well-established as it is, do you think there's a danger that this leads to levels that feel a little bit samey and formulaic, because everyone is kind of doing the same thing?
That's interesting. You mean like if people are, if designers are all following these principles, then like across games you might get levels that are kind of, as you say, like formulaic. They feel like they're essentially doing the same thing for the player.
Yeah.
And does that become boring? That's interesting. I'm not sure if I'm a good person to answer that question. I am, as you well know, Dan, I'm quite easily pleased, really. I'm not actually that critical when it comes to entertainment media. Like I can watch what's probably critically quite a bad film, but still quite like just enjoy it. And I think my kind of outlook on life when it comes to that sort of thing is like, I'd rather enjoy something than not enjoy something, and there's almost like, to some degree that's almost like a choice. And I just rather choose to enjoy it. Like, then I've not wasted my time. But anyway, but yeah, I suppose there is a risk to that. And thinking about a lot of FPS games, I suppose you do have a lot of, certainly maybe the levels that are most at risk of doing this are perhaps like the early phases of that game, or maybe that's when you're most aware of it, because it's often in the kind of first half hour or the first few levels of a game that's like they're like teaching you hard on like this is the stuff you need to know to play the game, essentially.
Yeah.
So there is probably, I'd certainly say that yes, like the beginning of games does often feel teaching heavy, and that can be a bit of a That can be a bit of a blocker. I think I'm aware of this particularly because, like, recently, and this is not like me, but I've recently kind of been playing quite a few games, like starting quite a few games, and so I've kind of probably got like about 5 games on the go that are like, I'm in that kind of early teachy stage of like all of them. And so I mean that does come a little bit wearing times. And I suppose, when a game is particularly novel or particularly difficult, that kind of forces the game to spend more time doing that stuff, because it's like it requires more of the player, so it needs to kind of teach them to be good at it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Have you got some examples in mind? Did you have something in mind when you asked that question?
Not exactly, but I think that back in the day, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, when things were a little less well established and game development was a little bit more of a Wild West.
Yeah.
People didn't have rules to follow, so sometimes levels were just a random jumble, or, they might be very experimental. Was that a good thing? Sometimes, I think. I think that there's something to be said for breaking the mold and trying something new. But at the same time, you have to make sure it's fun.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I think, particularly looking at games from the late 90s. There are quite a few, like, there are some games that were outrageously successful that, like, legitimately, like, critically, there are quite a few errors, really. And like, there's like, this was not a good level design, or this is the bit, like, this bit everyone hates, and there's quite, there's a fair bit of that, and like,
yeah,
I replayed, I played Half-Life for the first time recently, from beginning to end, and there's a whole like section in there which is a good, I mean, it probably took me a good hour or 2 hours, like it's called On a Rail, okay, and it is like almost universally hated, and the remake of so Black Mesa that remade Half-Life, they actually removed that section. They didn't include it because it's like, wow, it's so hated, and like one of the big criticisms of it is it kind of ruins the pacing of the game, I think, is one of the criticisms. So like, yeah, that is, I mean, it's kind of part of their charm to some degree, that you can kind of, I think with older games you almost have a sense of the design team, and you're kind of, I feel like there is a bit of like you almost have a relationship with them as you're playing the game. You're kind of aware of them, perhaps more than you are with new games. There's so much like polish on new games that I'm not kind of thinking about that. Whereas like in older games, when like there was a team of 6 people or 10 people or something, I'm kind of aware of like, oh, the designers might have done this or that or the other. Another good example might be Quake, where like that was, I think that is a game which, like, if you're interested, go search it on YouTube, because there's like, it's quite well documented just how fragmented and kind of broken that process, like the development of that game was, and it kind of broke up id Software a lot. Like a lot of people left, like as soon as that game was done. It was like it was not kind of managed well at all, but like each episode was basically done by a different person, and the coordination of between each episode, essentially there wasn't any. There was very little, and you see that kind of in the feel of the game, and like the feel of those levels, but also like the narrative doesn't hook up either. Like if you actually, like, you read, you often as games would often have in that time, you'd have like a bit of flavor text for like each episode, maybe at the beginning, a bit at the beginning, a bit at the end or something, and like even the narrative doesn't even make sense. Like characters they talk about are like like a character at one point, and then they're like a domain or like a realm in another bit of flavor text. Like it doesn't actually make any sense.
It kind of reminds me of the last Star Wars trilogy. I'm sorry, I had to say it.
I fear a rabbit hole coming. So anyway, I think there's I think to what you said, I like there's a charm, and there's like, yeah, the risk taking is cool, and the kind of the freedom to kind of break the mold is cool. Sometimes the results would be a bit challenging for players and frustrate players, but it made for some cool and creative things as well.
I do actually have an example of that.
Please.
From a Star Wars game. This was Star Wars Jedi Knight. The level design isn't always great, but there's one level which just really stuck out to me because it's so unique. And the whole level takes place on a falling ship.
Okay.
And because the ship's falling, it's at an angle. So the whole level, you're inside the ship, but you're also the whole level's rotated.
Oh, right.
So like all the floors are sloped, and you're having to traverse this ship, but meanwhile, it's at this crazy angle, which feels weird at times, but it's memorable. I'll give it that.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's a cool. Someone would have just been like, "Here's a cool idea," and then just run with it.
Yeah.
I love
or just
that.
Accidentally rotated the level and then was like, "Oh, actually, yeah, that's kind of cool."
Well, that's the other thing. You do learn about these things, don't you? Like, oh, that was a mistake, but then we just didn't fix it or thought it was cool, and so we left it in. Now, I'm going to jump this on you because I've not pre-prepared you at all for this question.
Oh, here we go.
But I felt like I'll be remiss if I didn't ask this. So listeners of the podcast may know Dan has designed several games, but most recently designed and released a game called Abacus, which is a sort of retro 2D platformer. Now there are, I think from memory there are 5 different worlds.
Yeah.
Each of which has a series of levels. I don't know how many, but 6 or 7 or 8 or something like that.
I think it was 5 levels in each world.
5 levels in each world. Okay, cool. So I guess my question to you, what was your approach? You said you weren't a level designer, which kind of my ears pricked up because I was like, oh well, you are, because you've designed 25 levels for Abacus. So you can't deny that there's some level of level designer in you. So what was your approach? Did you have an approach to level design in your game? And what were you aiming to do between like levels 1 to 5 in your episode or in your kind of world? What were you trying to accomplish, or what journey were you hoping to bring the player along? Give me a bit of your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I'll start by just giving a bit of background because, yeah, professionally I'm not a level designer, but I have done lots of level design in the past. I started off making Mario levels. Well, before that, maybe I made Doom levels. I made some Mario levels for Super Mario World using a third-party editor called Luna Magic. Since then, Nintendo have released Super Mario Maker, which is kind of like an official version of that, and I've made levels for that as well. So I have made a lot of levels in the past, and funnily enough, I was just rewatching some of my Mario Maker levels on YouTube this week. It was just interesting to sort of reflect on them. Some of them I think were pretty good, some of them not so good. But as far as Abacus goes, I struggled a bit with that because I was using my own engine. And normally when you're working in an engine, you have the tools to make these sort of block out levels. And in Abacus, I didn't really invest in any tools like that. So my level editor was quite basic. It worked, but I think I didn't really spend enough time just like playing around and experimenting because I was more focused on creating something that worked thematically. I wanted the game to be a journey across these worlds. And yeah, I wanted there to be, in a sense, some environmental storytelling. So, for example, at the end of the first world, you go into a cave, and then the second world, you're in the cave, and then at the end, you come out of a sort of well in the desert, and the third world's the desert. So it all links together. But I was so focused on the graphics, because I had to make all the graphics myself, that took away a little bit from the freedom that I had to just play around with the levels themselves, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I would have liked, if I could do it again, I would like to iterate a bit more and design the levels without really caring about what they look like initially, and then worry about the art later. But because I was very aware of having to make all the art myself, I kind of focused a lot on that from the beginning, which affected the design of the levels.
Interesting. As a player, I don't think I'm not aware of, well, that doesn't come across, I think, in that I don't feel like the levels are like lacking because they were, it doesn't feel like they've kind of prioritized art over the gameplay. Like the gameplay, I don't know. I mean, I guess, as a player, you just kind of accept what you're given, I suppose. But yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, certainly like that you do get the thematic thing. So the thematic thing was important to you, and I think we sort of mentioned earlier, like the kind of that kind of artistic, or certainly the kind of decoration and design of a level. That's part of it as well, and I think that comes across. So one last thing I wanted to ask you about this was, which I think I've asked you maybe once before about this, was like essentially like kind of difficulty, or like maybe not difficulty, but essentially like how do you like design challenges and yeah, the right level of difficulty, I suppose, into a level. Like I almost like, this is probably thinking too far ahead, and this just isn't the way a game is made, but like let's say you have like, I don't know, 12 mechanics, and you might kind of think, okay, well in the first level I'm going to sort of introduce one, or maybe like in the next level I'm going to introduce the next one, and then in the third level I'm going to use like both of them together, and that's like how that kind of progresses, and how this kind of the player gets a sense of like progression and escalating challenge and whatever. Did you think in those terms in any sense, or is it just like just kind of finding your way as you go, and just as you kind of test and play through, it's like, yeah, this feels like this feels like a good level, and it feels like it's maybe a bit harder or a bit different to the last one, so that's a tick, move on.
I'd say a little bit of both, because I designed the worlds in the order that they're played. So when I made World 1, I hadn't even implemented a lot of the mechanics that you see in the later worlds. So I didn't have the option to use them to make a harder level. So World 1, I deliberately made the enemies very easy. You got just different birds that fly around. And I also made the jumps very easy, because jumping is a key mechanic in the game. So I made sure that, a lot of the jumps, it's quite hard to fail them, to be honest with you.
Sure.
Just to ease the player into it. And then as the worlds progressed, the jumps got harder, the enemies got harder. I introduced new gameplay objects and mechanics that all kind of came together to make it maybe too hard in places. But yeah, no, it doesn't pull its punches, that game.
Nice. Okay. Cool. I think that was a good answer. So I'm aware of time's ticking away, and there are a few things I want us to discuss before we run out of time. So I kind of want us to talk about examples of good level design, or examples of bad level design. I guess to some degree we've sort of talked about good level design quite a bit. So I think we will just touch on that right now, but maybe sort of blast past it. So I'll just I'll take the first thing from myself, and that is, so good level design. There's two examples I'd just like to bring to the table very quick, and one is just Doom Episode 1, Mission 1, E1M1. Most people must be, I expect, will be familiar with this, and I think it just, it introduces just like the feel of the space you're in, and the kind of world you're going to occupy for the next 7 missions. Like the top 3 most common, like the 3 most common enemies you're going to encounter for the rest of the game, essentially, and like the kind of the most used weapons as well. And I think it kind of does that gently. There's danger, but it's kind of like just in that within one level you've had the opportunity to sort of discover secrets, like pull switches, be introduced to and kill those enemies. I don't know. I think it does that well. So that's one example. The other example was a bit harder to kind of. I can't put my finger on it, or couldn't kind of. I'm not sure if I could kind of say more than this, but so Unreal Tournament 2004. I might be overstepping my bounds here, but I just think that game is like a masterclass in level design. I can't think of many levels in it at all that are not just excellent. I suppose unlike other games, it's primarily essentially a multiplayer game. Whether you're playing with bots or you're playing with other humans, but it's essentially it's a load of players running around a map. So the main thing, I guess, to achieve on every occasion is just like for it to be engaging and for there to be various different routes. And I guess like the main job of the level designer is to kind of funnel players into interesting spaces to have a fight, and for that to be varied and for that to be kind of interesting. And I just think they do an excellent job of it, like time and time again. Like the amount of levels that are just like interesting and exciting places to do combat. So I would praise that game for doing a great job for level design.
Yeah, multiplayer level design is kind of almost a different kettle of fish, because it's got a different objective.
Sure.
I think one thing that is very important in multiplayer level design is that if you're new to the game, if you don't know the level, it's got to tell you straight away, like, where you need to go. There's nothing worse than, joining a deathmatch and just wandering around, not being able to find the action or the other team,
Getting
I
wrecked.
think exactly. One game that does this quite well is Team Fortress 2, because it doesn't mess about, there's just big red and blue arrows everywhere that tell you, this way to the enemy base. So if at any point you get turned around, it's not hard to just find an arrow to set you back on the right path.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think it's interesting because that's an example, as you've just put it, as good level design or a good design principle for a multiplayer game, which I think is almost the inverse of what you might suggest is good level design for a single player game. I think I've certainly heard it suggested that basically if you need to like put an arrow, if you need to be that obvious about telling the player where to go, like in a single player level, you've essentially failed. Like you've screwed the job. You've not done a good job as a level designer. I've certainly heard that criticism of there's one particular level in Doom which has like a big arrow on the floor, and it's like, this level wasn't very intuitive, was it?
Yeah, because in single player games, the level design, it does tend to guide the player, but it's very subtle. So that if you're not aware of the techniques, you might not even notice you're being led, but generally you're being led, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're more experienced, or you've picked up on some of the cues, that can be really helpful actually when you get stuck. And this is actually one of the things I was going to talk about for bad level design, is when you get stuck. And I would find this actually frustratingly in 90s shooters, for example, where you're just like, you've done all the obvious things you can think of, and now it's like there's clearly a next step, but I don't know what it is, and I'm running around the same corridors again and again trying to work out what the hell it is I'm supposed to do next. I could name several names, but I think it was a bit of a theme amongst the 90s shooters, and I think when you do look, there are games where you sort of clock like, oh, it does that sort of thing when it's trying to tell you, to go one way or another. That can help in those situations. It's like, okay, what clues are the devs trying to give me?
Yeah.
Which is handy. But so yeah, I think getting lost is a sign of bad level design. So I think you've not really shown the player what they should be doing, and I guess you want an element of like they should work it out, but That's definitely leaning towards the frustrated end, or frustrated and bored actually. To what you were saying earlier, it is kind of the frustrated and bored at the same time, which is not great. So I think there's definitely things about getting lost. I had a few examples, but I think that the main one I want to mention here for bad level design is a level in Halo. So Halo Combat Evolved, the first Halo game. And it's called The Library, I believe. Again, slightly infamous, I think. And this is when you sort of first meet the Flood, which is a faction in the game. And when you first meet them, that's a cool moment. But then you go into this library complex to get the index, I think. But essentially, it's a lot of copy paste. I think it was quite a cheap level to build for the dev team. Essentially, I can't remember how many levels of it of like, because you literally go up, you go on a lift, and then you're like on the next level of it, and then you go again, and and there must be like 5, 6, 7 times, and each time there's like a very subtle variation, but it's essentially the same corridors. Get attacked by the Flood again and again and again, and you're just like, it's not. After you've done a few, it's like, this isn't fun anymore. Yeah. I'm not engaged. This is just a drag, and I think that level would be fine if it were half the length. But it is. It's properly like. I don't know how long it actually takes, but I wouldn't be surprised if it takes an hour of just the same corridors, and it's really like it's really not much variation at all. And if it's not an hour, it feels like one. So that is my top contender for bad level design. Give me your best shot. What have you got?
Well, it's funny because I'm actually going to mention 2 games right now, which are games that you've actually praised for their design or their level design. And I think they do get a lot of stuff right. But okay, first example, Braid.
Yeah.
I liked that game. I thought the puzzles were good. It was pretty fun. There was one particular section which did my head in, and it's because it failed to do exactly the thing which you mentioned earlier that it did well, which is teaching the player. There was one particular puzzle where it just doesn't teach you what to do. It's like this one mechanic that's not used anywhere else in the game.
Yeah.
Which is, there's like a jigsaw puzzle kind of in the background, and you have to drag the puzzle pieces with the mouse to complete the puzzle, and only when you've completed the puzzle can you then walk along the top of it.
Okay.
And I just remember getting completely stumped on that because it was like this very unique mechanic which wasn't used anywhere else.
Yeah.
Other than that, Braid was good, but just that one thing annoyed me. And by the same token, Doom, I think Doom's a very mixed bag. There's one level that stands out to me as being frustrating. I can't remember the name of the level, but basically there was a big indoor lava section at one point inside some sort of castle, and there's a teleporter in the middle on a raised platform, and basically if you go up to this platform, bearing in mind you're like taking lava damage this whole time, you activate the platform and it lowers, and it's a teleporter. What I didn't realize was that the teleport destination is different depending on which side you enter from. Which is just not obvious at all. So I thought, okay, this teleporter goes here, which is not helpful to me. Not going to do that again.
Yeah, because you're only going to take damage, and
Yeah, and I was just stumped for ages. So that's always stuck out to me as being like a badly designed level.
Yeah, that's a tricky mechanic, and it's one that I forget actually because I'm just so aware of it now. But you're right, that would have absolutely stumped me in my youth. And actually, as you say, Doom is a mixed bag, and I have so many memories of just being stuck on levels for Doom. Time and time again, and I still find that now actually. So there are lots of great things about it, but there are lots of challenging things about it too. To your thing about Braid, and this isn't necessarily a criticism of the level design, but Braid remains one of the few games where I have like had an accompanying notebook. Like I've like scribbled down like these are the things I know about the mechanic, and here's my challenge. And I was like basically like working out the solution for some of these levels on a piece of paper. Like, how do I do this? Because I just like there was almost like too much going on for me just to intuit it as I played. I was like, I need to sit down and think because this is like not straightforward. But I guess it's memorable. I've come away and I could with that thought burnt into my mind. It was definitely frustrating at times, but again, it was rewarding being able to complete the levels.
I actually quite like it when a game requires you to have like pen and paper handy rather than spoon feeding you everything through a quest log,
Yeah, I think it is. Well, I mean, your preference, it would be is quite not very handholdy at all. I'm not sure if I want to kind of jot down my own quest log on my piece of paper. I think that's a bit of hassle that I'm not really willing to have. But yeah, I think there is an element to which when there are too many aids for the player, it kind of trivializes the experience. It's just like, well, what do you really need from me?
Yeah, I think my quest log remark was maybe a step too far, but there's just something quite satisfying about like having to write down a symbol that you saw, and then later, you find somewhere where you have to pick the right symbol or refer back to it, and you're like, oh, I wrote that down, and it's just it adds like another dimension to the game.
Yeah.
That I quite enjoy occasionally.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I like that. I think it makes you feel cool as a player because it's like, oh, I worked that out, or I remembered that thing, and then that's brought me. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so I've got a couple things finally to say. Let's try this one out. Good level design should play to the strengths of the game mechanics. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second. What inspired me to say that is Spyro. Something you said earlier made me think of it. And I think, a lot of Spyro levels they're actually quite simple. Like, as I kind of revisit them, it's like, they're really often, like, some of them are just like essentially 3 rooms, it's like, there's not a lot to them. But they didn't feel that way as a kid, and they still don't like necessarily feel that way when I'm playing them, even though I'm aware of it at times. But I think some of what Spyro does is like it just. I mean, certainly this was a big deal at the time. It's like this feeling of space and feeling of being able to just like charge around without too much impeding you. Really, it was just kind of a sense of freedom and being able to just run around, and that feeling was really cool. I think that was really playing to the strengths of the game. Of like Spyro's thing is like flying and charging around really fast. Like those are kind of those are the things that are really fun to do with Spyro, and some of the levels I've really enjoyed most. Let's like lean into that. Like I was kind of taken aback at like how few obstacles there were in one particular level, and I was like, there's like nothing to this, but then it was actually so fun because I could just charge around without really even having to think, and that was just a great feeling. So good level design leans into the strengths of like the mechanics of the game. What do you think?
Yeah, I like it. I've not heard that before, but I like it, and it makes a lot of sense. Like the strengths of Doom, it's such an easy example to use. Strengths of Doom in my mind is like it's very fast paced. So if you have a level that takes that away from the game, and just turns it into like a very slow experience, maybe like with lots of switches and doors and lifts, then yeah, probably that's not going to be very fun.
Yeah, you're like artificially breaking up that flow, and like a big part of that game is like the speed of it, I guess, or like and like almost like there's some similarities to Spyro, and there's that kind of sense of like I think it's been described as like almost like skateboarding around, the feel of like how you the movement in Doom, and yeah, like you kind of want to make use of that, and yeah, if you're stuck in corridors, then that's that's a real challenge. Um, so yeah, I'm also interested in the concept of level design for real-time strategy. I'm not sure this is a big section really, but I'm just wondering, like, is every real-time strategy level, like, how much variation is there really? Is it much the same every time? You know, is it just a nice landscape, you know, with like useful places to have bases, or is there more than that? I'm not sure if there is. I mean, certainly most real-time strategy games I play, like, I don't know, each level, you know, you've got a slightly different layout of the land, and probably, you know, you've unlocked a few more buildings because they're kind of teaching you as you go, you know, and through the campaign, and like, oh, now you can make this type of unit, and that kind of brings the development, I suppose, of and progression. But like in terms of level design, I don't know how much it varies. I guess, you know, you might have like bottlenecks and stuff around the map. And I was trying to think before this conversation, like, what could you do as a designer of a real-time strategy game to like bring more challenge or interest or like, I don't know, variation in your level design? And I was thinking, oh, you know, maybe you could have like, you know, units might have to like flip a switch, or, you know, or like, I don't know, drop a drawbridge, or like, I was kind of, all I could think of really was like essentially impediments to movement that like the player then had to like interact with something to fix, or to, you know, and maybe you could do some of that in a clever way, but mostly it just felt like things that would slow down the game and effectively be a frustration to the player, which is maybe why you don't see those things. So it is a different, you meant kettle of fish, I think. But am I being unfair? Is there more to it than I'm painting a picture of?
So there are a few things that come to mind there. The first is that some games that I've seen introduce like almost king of the hill elements. So there are certain areas of the map that if you control those areas, you get some kind of benefit, which can change the gameplay in a big way. Another example that came to mind is Rival Realms, which is like a very old, obscure game that no one's heard of. But that actually lets you manipulate the map in various ways. So there are certain units which can blow up mountains, or place land, or place water, which was cool. But fundamentally, it's kind of what you were just saying. Like, it's, in some ways, it's just there are impediments to movement that you have to overcome. But I think it's also a bit more than that, because it's not just in certain areas where you can place land or place water or place traps. Like, you can do that anywhere. So to an extent, you can make the map work for you.
That is that's an interesting mechanic, actually. Because like, the first thing that comes to my head is like, there are those units that could create land, right? So like, you might be in a base where you think you're safe because you've got essentially a moat, or there's like a lake that's kind of, you know, no one's coming from that direction.
Yeah.
And then someone could just make a land bridge, essentially.
Think again.
Yeah. That's a cool. There are some cool mechanics in that game.
I think another thing which makes level design quite challenging for RTS games is that when you get to like a very competitive level, it's very important that things are balanced. So level designers have the challenge of like making a level that looks organic and natural, while also making sure that players have exactly the same resources, you know?
Yeah, that's so challenging. I mean, as someone who's you know, had a little go at making the odd RTS map, I can say that is hard. And I think I've made some levels where you just have to accept, like, you know, that player over there gets a bit more of this, and that's just that's just the way it is. Like, suck it up. It's like, yeah, doing it effectively and making it feel natural and in place. Yeah, that must be a skill of its own.
There's a difference also in if we're talking about competitive RTS maps, or if we're talking about like single player kind of campaign based RTS maps, because those I think have a lot more scope to do funky things. Like Warcraft 3 and Age of Mythology are two examples that come to mind where they had some really cool levels in the campaign, which just did interesting things with the game that you wouldn't expect to see in an RTS.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, Age of Empires 2, for example, there are some elements there which almost make it feel.
Sorry, I'm just remembering like an Age of Empires 2 map that you once created, and you wanted there to be like a neutral team. So you assign them all to like Gaia. And then what happened was, as soon as you went up to them, they all just immediately turned to your team. Sorry, that just like came to me.
That is a great memory. I love that. I've got a few more things to say about Age of Empires sometime, by the way, although I think it's for another time. But there are elements in some of those levels that like it blurs the line between RTS and almost like RPG at times, because you kind of got certain heroes that you're kind of following, and you've got objectives that feel kind of like questy and a bit that sort of thing. That's there's a lot more than just build a town and crush your foes. So yeah, there is as you say, there's a lot more scope, particularly for single player maps in that genre. That's a good challenge and interesting one. Okay, so I think that might bring us to the end of our discussion of level design. We've had some really good questions there, and I think you've brought some really great, some interesting thoughts, particularly from your experience of working in the industry and your time at Abacus. So listen, thank you so much everyone for listening, and do tune in for the next episode. Until then, see you around.